in this episode?
We have to take in sexual harassment that's happening around us, in particular at scientific conferences. So that's something not to romanticize, because people believe the scientific conference is a free ticket. It's not happening at any university, so no one can directly sue you or make you problems. And it's such a romantic, nice environment. People are sitting in hotels having drinks with each other in the evening. So such events are specifically problematic and need certain ways of how behavior should be regulated and what should happen there.
Hey everyone, welcome to my second conversation with Dr. Vlasta Sikimić, and this podcast was in fact quite a bit different because we conversed over a video that the physicist Sabine Hossenfelder uploaded on her channel called My Dream Died and Now I'm Here. It was regarding some of her academic woes and her reflecting on her life as an academic for the around past 20 years, I'd assume. And Vlasta and I thought that the video by Dr. Hossenfelder would give us some good talking points and ignite and inspire some interesting conversations regarding academic life and the broader philosophy of education, which is what Vlasta works on. On top of that, she also works on meta-science, and I've already spoken to her and I found some of the points she brings up quite interesting. And again, from her work, from her very empirical work, might I add, what I always appreciate is that she shows some of the points made more by the humanities, by the arts, in, let's say, more speculative so-called continental philosophy, that science isn't this acontextual black box, but rather science itself sits within a social institution, a social symbolic space, to use a Zizkian term, and she shows that through her work on epistemic equity, linguistic intolerance, and more work she's done on the meta-science of peer reviews and whatnot. And also, look, leaving aside kind of her academic work, just as a person, I'd consider her my friend, and even if I might say this, a mentor of mine. I've really looked up to some of the work she's done, and just seeing her CV as someone wanting to get into academia, it's sort of the footsteps I want to follow. And I do appreciate that she's very candid. Vlasta is very candid with highlighting the realities of being an academic and pursuing academic life, the uncertainty, the kind of the trepidatious conditions, both psychologically and in one's career, professionally. So I do appreciate all of that, and I'm hoping to have her own podcast again, hopefully to discuss more of her work, but also to hopefully moderate a dialogue between her and some other philosophers of science. Having said that, without further ado, let's get started. But also, I realize I should be doing a bit of a formal introduction as to who Vlasta is. I mean, she's not like a random person online that's just commenting and reacting to a video, but rather she's actually worked on the social epistemology of science. So Dr. Vlasta Sikimić is an assistant professor of philosophy of science and a member of the philosophy and ethics group at Eindhoven University of Technology. Her research focus is on the social epistemology of science, meta-science, philosophy of AI and ML in science, and philosophy of AI in education. Also, as I mentioned, I already did speak to her. If you want to go watch our first conversation, where we more specifically discuss her work, the link to that is in the description down below. And on that note, here's Vlasta and I reacting to Sabine Hossenfelder's video while also having a broader discussion on the philosophy of education. All right, for the viewer, I'm here with the scintillating Vlasta Sikimić, and we already had a discussion regarding some of the topics that we'll be discussing in this video today. But this is a bit of a different podcast because we'll be I probably should change to the screen where you're there too. There you are. We'll be reacting to this video by the physicist Sabine Hossenfelder, which even by her standards, the video My Dream Died and Now I'm Here, it actually has gone viral. It was even trending on Twitter. It seems like a lot of people are paying attention to this video that she made on regarding her experience in academia. And I thought no better person to comment on this other than Vlasta. So before we get started, though, perhaps Vlasta, apart from the fact that you got a couple of requests to, give your views on Sabine's video, just in general, why do you think it's important to discuss and kind of like comment on what she brings up in this video?
In this video, she's discussing different problems in science, and these problems also lead to wrong production of knowledge, or to the replication crisis that we are now facing in science. So we have some perverse financial incentives, which on the one hand negatively impact knowledge that is gathered in science. And on the other hand, she also discusses the existential challenges of scientists and combines both of these topics to point out how the academic jobs are losing their attractiveness, and then people are just leaving for industry, which was in a way her case. From the perspective of the research of philosophy of science, this is exactly which we call social epistemology of science is dealing with. Social epistemology of science is a topic in which we are trying to understand how scientific community gathers knowledge as a whole. We also discuss there the questions of scientific integrity, the questions of open science, and all that is intertwined, because you cannot just observe knowledge, how knowledge is generated, without actually humans that are contributing to this knowledge and to their work conditions. And I did some empirical research, surveys and interviews with scientists about their job satisfaction and how that influences their career decisions.
Excellent. I knew apart from being a researcher, you also had the power of telepathy because you read my mind. That was going to be my next question as to the work you've done, which means we can get started. Yeah. Well,
maybe
video
it's not a power. Maybe it's not the power of telepathy. Maybe it's just the issue of professors that they like to speak a lot about their work.
Well, as an aspiring professor or academic, this is perfect for me because I love the sound of my own voice. I mean, which is probably why I started this podcast. So thank you for affirming the fact that I'm on the right path. Excellent. Great.
I think
without further ado, what was that? Sorry.
I think you definitely are on the right path.
I appreciate that. Thank you. That means a lot, Luster. Without further ado, let's get started. So, just for context again for the viewer, Vasori sent me a few timestamps. So I'll kind of be stopping at those points on the video, and then kind of I guess quizzing her on what her thoughts are. And then we'll go along from there. Alrighty, here we go.
When I signed up for studying at the university, I thought being a physicist was my dream job. But here I am on YouTube. How did that happen? I think I owe you an explanation. When I started studying at the university, my expectations were based on biographies of scientists. They wrote a lot of letters to each other. They went to conferences. They were thinkers and tinkerers and had sometimes heated but usually respectful arguments. This is what I expected. Yes, that was hopelessly naive, I know. But in my defense, I don't come from an academic background. I come from a family of teachers and accountants and post office workers. They're normal people. I did an internship in the chemical industry and another one in a bank, gleefully stamping transfer slips. I just didn't know anyone with a PhD. And those were the early 1990s. You couldn't just ask the internet and within a day you'd have 2,000 people giving you advice and some marriage proposals along with that. The first years at university were glorious because for the first time in my life, I was in the company of other people who were like me. At school, I had always been the weird one for actually being interested in science and maths. But at the university, everyone was like that. We talked about everything from maths to philosophy, physics, and politics. And yes, alcohol was involved. It was a really good time. And that was all very nice, except I was getting older and still didn't have a decent job. I made a little money by selling oil paintings. Those were the days, people. But I didn't seriously think I was a particularly good artist. I really had to get a normal job and stop asking my grandma to help out with paying rent. I thought that the Institute of Physics would give me a job when I'd finished my master's degree with good grades. Though technically at the time that was called a diploma. I thought they'd give me a job because that had worked for all the other students previously. If your grades were good, they'd offer you a job as a graduate student. It wasn't particularly great pay, but it was a real job. And that's where things started to go wrong. Because I finished my exams with excellent grades. I don't mean to brag, but I think you need this context. But I wasn't offered a job because I'm a woman. I'm not guessing that that's what happened. I know because they told me. You see,
Alrighty, starting off with a very touchy topic there.
I mean, it's not surprising. So first of all, these expectations that the doors will just open for us because we are good students, that doesn't really happen, right? One has to open the door by themselves. And the fact that science is nowadays, and also, I mean, nowadays inherits something from the past, where one is expected to be a cisgender white male in order to be a proper scientist. And of course, that science was even advocating for some differentiations among human beings. We should not forget about that. And nowadays that is switching, but that is switching because also the social pressure is there, and also because more people from other groups are participating in science. It is not surprising that women have less opportunities to do science. And the further you go in the career path, the more visible this becomes. So on this PhD level, where Sabine was entering, there it was still possible to do so. But to go to full professorship, you will see that statistics changes dramatically, and there are very few women in science. But again, I would like to emphasize that the discrimination is against everyone who doesn't conform with this norm, and it's just not spoken so much about it. And a lot of people hide their identity or hide how they might feel and try to just conform with the patterns. And with the patterns, I mean also the way how we are dressed, the clothes that we are wearing, colors that we are wearing, the way how we speak. We have to be perfect in English. We have to look very professional. We have to take in sexual harassment that's happening around us, in particular at scientific conferences. So that's something not to romanticize, because people believe the scientific conference is a free ticket. It's not happening at any university, so no one can directly sue you or make you problems. And it's such a romantic, nice environment. People are sitting in hotels having drinks with each other in the evening. So such events are specifically problematic and need certain ways of how behavior should be regulated and what should happen there. And then you can just get, you can also have double stigmas. So if you are, I will speak on my about myself because that's the most natural. But if you are an East European woman, then you have a double stigma. You're stigmatized as the East European scientist and as a woman. And then you might get at work comments like, yes, but you know, in East Europe, I can see that women would wear heels. However, in some emancipated country, this doesn't really happen. And then, you know, you can kind of decide to ignore this microaggression, or you can think and say, look, we have right to wear whatever we like, as long as it's, I mean, I'm there even more liberal, like I would really not put the restrictions there, but I mean, but a scientist can definitely look in any way, can have, I mean, I now on purpose wear something red to show I don't have to be in black, I don't have to be in a uniform to be a scientist and that people take me seriously. I also try not to correct my accent too much because I am who I am. I am not a native speaker and I represent what I am, and I should still be taken seriously. And I think all these points are very important. And then, of course, there are other problems in which this video will also refer, and that's the planning the family and receiving comments regarding this. So are you really thinking to have a child now? Or like some of my interviewees who were saying, you can do everything but just not stay pregnant, because that will create a problem for the principal investigator. Yeah, that is like a principal investigator is very happy to have scientists and is very supportive, but in order, it's a man, that he gets his grant extension or a next grant, he cannot afford that someone is absent for a year.
Interesting. I'm not sure.
Or in some other countries, these parental leaves are shorter, so that's changing the game a little bit, but it's still, because you are implicitly expected to work overtime, that will have a negative impact.
Yeah, I mean, the viewers should probably fact check me on this, but I think in Australia, it's illegal to ask that question, which is good. You can't ask the question, regardless of the gender, are you planning to have children? Because that shouldn't factor in.
Of course, nobody is asking. So the question is illegal to be asked. This is the implicit rule of academia, not an explicit one. There is an implicit pressure. But the question that I mentioned was more a comment, and it was not from the boss. It was a comment from a peer.
Yeah.
That is not something you can stop.
Indeed. Yeah, that's a really good example, Vasa, because like as you know, one of my intellectual heroes, Zizek, has this idea that a lot of culture, it's not what's formally on paper, what's formally out there in like an explicit sense, but rather it's these unspoken rules, these background practices, these comments that you can't pinpoint anywhere. And kind of patriarchy is a good example of that, because you can't really see the patriarchy anywhere on paper. Nowhere does it say explicitly women should be discriminated against, or, well, not now. It was the case in the past. But of course, the kind of structural issue of the patriarchy, it's still, more like through the comments like that, these assumptions we hold. So that's a very good example. I would just probably want to mention here, perhaps if you think it's apt for this comment, your work on linguistic injustice. Maybe if you want to kind of just comment a bit on that, because that seems a lot to do again with, people, as you mentioned, not fitting into this, not conforming into this idea of what a scientist is, and then kind of that, of course, touches on language and how we speak as like English in this case. Perhaps if you could comment on your work on linguistic injustice, Vlasta.
Yeah, the point is that someone can have a great scientific discovery, and we talked about it in the previous podcast. Even though this person is not able to communicate this in the perfect language, in the perfect English language, which is lingua franca. And I recently saw an interesting meme which says English is a language, not an intelligence scale.
Yes.
And there, the point is also not how someone is able to speak, but also how charitable we are when we are listening. So whether we are good listeners, and we should also improve our abilities to listen to people, and not just our abilities to communicate well. So to mitigate this type of injustice. And this type of injustice also has there are also deeper epistemic injustices that happen in science, and they can also be that people don't really trust the testimonies. For instance, in this case, what we used as an example of women, because they don't face these problems and they just don't consider them as serious or as important. And even there, it's very important to speak up, because there are people who would be open and who would like to change the climate, but they are maybe not even aware of all the problems that people are facing around them. And the last point is this, that we might all be silent. So actually, a lot of us maybe have exactly the same feeling and would like to change the same things, but we are just all thinking, assuming that other people belong to this toxic masculine, the stereotypical, right? So what you call patriarchal matrix, and but they don't, right? So maybe sometimes it's just enough to speak up, and then you notice, okay, there are so many people that think similar to me.
No, I thought it was worth mentioning. Excellent. And the next one's going to be interesting. So we'll go back to the video, and we'll talk about the other bit about you know what? Let Sabine say it instead of me saying it, because she sounds better than I do.
Guy who was head of the institute told me that since I'm female, I should apply for a scholarship that was exclusively for women in the natural sciences, because then the institute wouldn't have to pay for me. Makes sense, doesn't it? So, well, I applied for the scholarship and got it, all right. But these scholarships don't come with any benefits like pension savings and health insurance. And I know they sound very German, but these things matter to us. Also, I was now reminded on various occasions that I wasn't actually employed at the institute. I was just there because I had this scholarship for women. And that was totally true. This, by the way, is why I'm against programs or positions that are exclusively for women. I think that treating women differently just reinforces the prejudice that women are less capable than men. But I digress. All right.
So that was quite an interesting comment she made, because I do feel I both agree and disagree with her, but perhaps first I'll let you comment, Vlasta, and just hear your thoughts on it.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting topic, and it can be criticized from the perspective that Sabine mentioned, but it can also be criticized from the other perspective, and that the dominant group becomes now jealous, envious of the underprivileged group. And the reason why I use this underprivileged group, because underprivileged group might be even larger than the privileged group. For instance, there are more PhD students than full professors, but they're still underprivileged. In my work, and especially the one of the recent papers on the epistemic inclusion in science, I do advocate for equity measures, and equity measures assume certain affirmative actions, because we need to make sure that people who belong to groups that were systematically discriminated over the time get the fair chance, so the equal opportunity, right? So, because we can talk about the equal outcomes, and sure, it's not an equal outcome if someone doesn't have a health insurance and someone has.
Indeed.
And it's also not the equal opportunity that somebody doesn't get a job but is directed. It's cheaper for the principal investigator, right? So that to have self-funded students instead of funding them from the project. So those are the problems that come with such an affirmative measure as defined there. And there I would agree, there were clear problems. However, affirmative measures don't need to be designated in such a way. And another important thing to to mitigate the worry of the envy of the privileged group is then actually to reduce the level of affirmative measures once they start giving results. So once we have better gender balance or better social diversity in the team, then of course, then we can stop with it. What is interesting here, what is mentioned is the problem with this. Of course, it comes with this issue. If you get a scholarship, then you don't get healthcare, you don't get social security, which is later your pension. I'm not sure how is that in Australia, but that's the thing in Europe. And if you complain to your bosses about it, they often don't have a lot of understanding for that problem. Not in every country is the same. And in some countries in Europe, even the PhD salaries are not full salaries, but only certain percentages of a full salary. I'm now very lucky to be in the Netherlands, where PhD students have proper salaries and proper funding. But and there are also differences between humanities and natural sciences. So it can happen in Europe that somebody as a PhD student in humanities gets less money than someone working in natural sciences, which is another injustice, disciplinary one. But the important part with that is that having own funding, which is not project funding, gives certain freedom. And then the person only has to do what the scholarship holder is requiring. And also the principal investigator cannot require more than that, because these are not the terms of the scholarship.
Sorry, also probably for the layperson, like myself, like, what do you mean by having own funding? Would that be like a regular salary that researchers get?
No, I meant so one can be funded by a project, right? So what Sabine is saying, she was the principal investigator with whom she talked didn't want to give her project funding, didn't want to hire her, but said, you get the scholarship and work for me for free. I mean, free for him, right? She's paid by the government or by some other body, but she also then has to report to this other body. So you should have less obligations, because if you have all the same obligations, then you can also ask for the contract.
Indeed.
That's legally absurd. And that later helped her, which she will talk about in the video. It helped her because she was more independent. And there are some people really dream about the third option, which exists in some countries, and that's that you can get the central funding from the government by applying, that was the case in Serbia, by applying with your grades, CV, and so forth. And then you get the salary, so you have the pension insurance and so forth, so healthcare and so forth, but you are not directly paid from some project. So you have your own funding, which gives you more freedom, more independence of one principal investigator. But there are different ways to mitigate the situation. One can have more than one supervisor. So that is something very positive, to have supervisory teams, which is the case at my current university. So then people don't depend only on one person, which is much nicer. And of course, working on a project together with the supervisor makes a lot of sense, because it benefits the career of the PhD student, and you pick a supervisor based on the topic and the personality ideally and so forth. So it's I would never say that there is like a strict rule what is right and what is wrong. I would usually argue that it's good to have the plurality of different funding sources, so that a lot of people get opportunities, but definitely please give sufficient funds to PhD students or to PhD candidates, because these are the people with master degrees who worked very hard for that, who would in industry have probably higher salaries. And yeah, please make sure that they have health insurance, that they have pension insurance, at least in the European systems where this is expected for everyone. And yeah, I'm curious that you tell me what's the case in Australia.
Well, yeah, I mean, in Australia, it's not certainly as good as Europe, and certainly not as good as the Netherlands, because some of my friends, in fact, who are interested in research, have moved to the Netherlands because the education system there is much better. But I don't think we're as bad as like the US, for instance. We do the PhD students do get paid, but it's like it's 1/5 of what a livable wage would be. So, like, for instance, I want to pursue a PhD not next year, year after, because I'm still doing my master's, and I know that for a fact. Like, this podcast, I'm hoping will become one income for me to survive, and then the other would be I'll have to work part-time, because I know I can't survive on the PhD stipend. It's not even a full-time salary, really. So it's like what I found is I would like to ask you more about like kind of like the psychological toll on a researcher
Sure.
when all these financial pressures come into it, given you've kind of been through this. Because you know, as Sabine mentioned, health insurance, if you get sick, what do you do? Paying gold beyond like the US, we have a public healthcare system. Nonetheless, it's good to have some kind of health insurance provided by the institution. But yeah, so like more at like a broader level, like my whole understanding of this is like I don't think anyone goes into academia to get rich or to be wealthy. I mean, if you want to do that, go to the corporate world, go join like a consulting firm or something, you'll make a lot more money there. I'm assuming most people go to academia for the love of knowledge, for the love of research. So just what do you think are like the psychological impact on having these concerns for money constantly on the back of your mind when it comes to pursuing a PhD, and then afterwards it's called the postdoc work people do?
Can I first respond by, ask you one
Of course,
question?
of
So you
course,
said
of
you
course, of
only
course.
get 1/5 of what is livable wage. And
Indeed. I
there
mean, yeah, I'm just trying to calculate. So from what I know, and I'm not doing a PhD at the moment, but I've been like looking into this. It's around 30,000 Australian dollars. 30,000, like the average, the median income in Australia, I believe, is around 70,000. So I can send you all the proper. Again, the viewers should fact
yes,
check me on this.
what I
So
wanted
it's
to
quite
ask,
low. Yeah.
yeah.
So yeah, as I
So
said, it's quite low. Yeah.
what is there then the motivating factor for people to pursue their PhD? Do they have to be very privileged? Well, in your case, you said you would have to have a side job plus additional passive income or also active income and so on. What then motivates people to persevere so much, even though this is such a unfavorable situation?
Well, the answer is insanity. I mean, I don't know why you would do a PhD. I mean, maybe I joke around with my friends that maybe I'm some kind of like masochist. I get pleasure out of the suffering of going through academia because I don't see why when, in fact, I'd make a lot more money just working a basic job at like maybe hospitality or something. I'd make a lot more money because Australia has a really high minimum wage. Than doing a PhD, because perhaps I should mention this, Vlasta. So the stipend you make doing a PhD, which is around 30,000 Australian dollars. Again, please fact check me on this. That's much lower than what a person would be earning working full time just at minimum wage. So they get paid even lower than minimum wage. So I don't. The answer probably is insanity. There's no motivation to go pursue a PhD unless it's, and this is rare, but some PhD programs, it's sort of like funded by by a certain corporation, by a private industry, and then those projects pay better. But as far as I know, majority of PhD students are broke. So yeah, that's probably the answer to that question.
Yeah, I find this very worrisome, and it relates to your second question. Of course, this is a huge pressure on people, but also from the perspective of us as a community, we are losing epistemic potential through that. So we are for sure losing brilliant minds because we are not giving enough opportunities to people to do science and to have a dignified life by doing science, which is a very noble job and a very noble, as you said, a very noble motivation that you want to learn, that you want to improve your environment, to help society, and you don't really plan to get rich by it. So that is, yeah, that is of course very worrisome, and for sure the huge pressure on worrying about the existential challenges. I mean, that's already in Greek philosophy was known, in ancient Greek philosophy was known that you kind of one can do philosophy only when they are fed well, right? When they are not worried about existential
Yeah.
problems, and that does make sense. Because
Yeah.
of course, when someone is struggling, then it's clear what will the priority of the person be. Yeah, I'm sorry to hear this. I am now somehow surprised and shocked that there are so few opportunities, and I also wonder what can be done to improve this situation, because
Yeah,
it maybe
it is
also
unfortunate.
mirrors that society doesn't care about science enough. Or what do you think?
Uh, I doubt it, because like if you, in fact, if you look at some of the programs, even like the federal government in Australia, they talk a lot about, funding science, funding university programs, and whatnot. But unfortunately, I'm sorry to sound like a old-fashioned Marxist here, but I think it's an ideological problem within capitalism, because I hate this. Whenever I tell people that I want to go and do a master's and a PhD, most of the time the kind of the almost a spontaneous question I get is, "Oh, is that because then you can go and get a better job at some corporation?" I'm like, no, it's not about getting a better job. It's not a means to an end. I want to do it because I love academic life. I want a future in academia. It's not about trying to like go back into industry and trying to like get a better job at some company that pays better. So education, I don't know if this is universal, at least from my point of view. That's like, please do correct me if I'm wrong. Education is viewed as a means to an end, not an end in itself. And I find that quite unfortunate. And I think that's a result of the kind of the ideological system, or the ideological environment we're a part of, where everything has to kind of end in some kind of way of like profiting out of it, which is unfortunate.
Well, first of all, one response within the same paradigm could be, sure, maybe someone individually profits, but also the society profits when they're more educated people, whether
Indeed.
they work in industry or whether they work in academia. I mean, the whole society should profit from education. So I think sometimes these motives can even align. So that's how I would respond within the paradigm. And of course, if I would respond outside of that paradigm, I would completely agree with you that the point that there is the intrinsic value in education, and that
Absolutely.
if we want to be a just society, then we have to provide possibilities for the best possible education for everyone who is motivated to pursue it. There is then the third challenge or kind of objection, and this is like, yes, but you are supposed to motivate everyone to maximize their education, and then we're entering into some perfectionistic loop, which is then problematic. But definitely, we also have to try to motivate people, or at least explain to them potential of education for their life, if they come from families where this is not cherished enough.
Indeed. So before we move
So
on
that's
past
some
what
type of enlightenment. That's some type of enlightenment movement which is going on even nowadays.
as in you mean we need like a another like a renaissance where people see the value in education, or
No, I mean, that is this continuation of that, right? So I do come from a country that had the socialist past, where the idea was that people would send their children to listen some lectures at the university. So they didn't even have to finish the university or get the degree, but it was just believed that you are enriching your life if you attend some lectures at the university, and they are for free and open for everyone.
yeah, yeah. Well, that's really interesting. I'd even say segue, because what I wanted to ask you was, before we move on, perhaps, because I mean we are discussing academic woes here, but I also don't want to just just kind of be like a negative Nancy and just be like, oh, look how terrible things are, even though things are terrible. I'm quite cynical about things, but just maybe to summarize, what do you think can be some potential solutions to what we discussed regarding the topics we discussed up to now?
I think that one solution is that everybody takes their ground. So I think there are many more people who actually want the change and who actually would be happy to educate for free and to mentor for free, and to provide support for others. And that's one aspect. And I think reaching out to people can be very beneficial. The second aspect is this, that we should just be who we are and to be proud of what we are and who we are, and accept ourselves and expect others to accept us as well. And then also to work on being tolerant to diversity, because that is a value by itself. And then, of course, there is this kind of whether and how the society will change. Well, it's always that scientists or academics or all, they do influence both the education and the public opinion, and that in turn influences politics, and the public opinion does influence both the trends in science and the politics. And of
Absolutely.
course, what we talked, of course, the obviously that politics influences all those other things, but we can also influence it in back, right? So it's a loop. It's not just one way street. And I think opening these questions, these narratives, having more content for communication, platforms for communication, sharing your knowledge. I think already what you're doing with this podcast has a benefit in that sense, and it's a very nice initiative. And when you see it, like there is a lot of interest that people have in like having the philosophical theaters, open discussions, open lectures. There is now this huge trend with digitalization and AI, which in a sense can help, because now a lot will be available, but it can also make more injustice because it won't be available for everyone. And we have to keep in mind that some people don't even have computers. and
Yeah, that's true.
and some researchers don't have access to create large databases and this and that. And so there will be a lot of ethical and epistemic issues surrounding these questions. But they can also give some great opportunities, right? So they can help us in improving our written English.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm glad that you touched on both kind of individual virtues that we can embody, but also kind of the structural, more collective changes we can make, because I think it's not an either or. It's got to be both. And I should add, Vlasta, and I mean this sincerely, I'm grateful that people like you come on public programs like this podcast, or you even on the center. You've been on many podcasts. I've seen on your bio on your website that you do that kind of public outreach because, well, if the viewer would know this, but I never paid you. I never, you're doing this completely as a favor for myself and then the viewers. So we are very grateful for that.
Yeah, I'm happy that somebody finds my thoughts useful,
Absolutely, absolutely,
and I think it's
also
part of my job.
yeah, as like a public educator, right? And indeed, like when I was researching for our previous conversation, because it was focused on your work, I found that all of your publications were free. They were open. I didn't have to go through any paywall. They were all on open journals.
Well, that is another very big question. And publishing open access in academia is a big issue because I only publish open access, and since I live in countries where my universities can pay for open access. But when I lived in Serbia, that was not possible because our university couldn't pay for it. Nowadays, maybe it can, but back in the days, it was not an option. And then what happens with this open access is that journals charge researchers from developed countries, well, from rich countries. I would also consider Serbia a developed country, just not that rich, to make their work. So we pay that our work, which we did again for free and submitted there for free, and the reviewers did it for free and so forth,
Wow.
to make it visible for everyone for free, so that people in the less privileged countries can read it for free, but then they have to respond to us, and then they can respond to our work. But they have to then publish it closed access because they don't have money for open access. So it just increases this injustice. Or in some journals, they cannot even submit because some journals are only open access and you have to pay for it. And there are very few journals that are free and open access. And they are usually not the ones with high impact factors.
I see. Okay, so for brevity's sake, I'm saying, like, succinctly put it, you're saying that if we want publications or if we want papers to be available for the general public the way I, came across your work publicly, it was free, the universities have to ensure that it's funded, that the work is open to the public.
Yes.
I see. And these journals,
and you get, but just listen to this. Then you get kind of some funding agency says, oh, we kind of look how often did you publish open access? Did you choose open access? And then they kind of write my evaluation. I fairly frequently published open access, but not always. And then I'm like, yeah, sure, because I was in a country where this was not even possible, and you're asking us or everyone to publish open access so that people in those countries can read it, but cannot then, participate in the equal way in this discussion.
I see. Okay, I want to ask you more
so
questions.
So it's really hypocritical.
Indeed,
and whether journals make money, sure, journals make money. But I also understand journals might have some costs. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, even if it's just a website, you need to maintain, you need to run it. I understand. So, are these journals mostly like, I'm trying to understand, are they like private entities or are they affiliated with the government? How do they function? The big journals we see online.
The big publishers. The big publishers are often private.
They're private, right?
And sometimes they have professional editors who get salaries, but sometimes they have academic editors who get not so much compensation or almost no compensation. And the reviewers who are invited, so this peer review process, when I'm reviewing papers, I don't get paid for that. So it's just out of my time.
I've heard about this too. In fact, some of my friends who, like you, are professors, they told me it's just like almost like a favor they do, because it's they don't get paid for peer reviewing, which is an important part of the academic process, right? Excellent. I certainly want to ask you more about this, but the good thing is Sabine also touches on this point in a few minutes, so perhaps we'll get there, and then we'll see what she says. And I'm kind of keen to hear, kind of ask the broader philosophy of education question as to what, how academia has changed, and how this culture has come into be in some sense. But nonetheless, let's just probably play this.
You might say, stop whining, at least I did have an income now. Yes, so far so good. At this time, I was the only woman at the institute who was not in the administration. The next problem was that the head of the institute made a lot of money selling textbooks. He wrote very little of these textbooks himself. Rather, he gave assignments for parts of the books to students and postdocs, which is why, in case you've ever wondered, these textbooks are so discontinuous and partly repetitive. He expected me to also work for him, to which I said no. I was then ordered into his office, in which he gave me a very angry speech, according to which I wasn't loyal to all the other students who did their part. I told him that I was under no obligation to work for him and didn't care what the rest of the students were thinking. He got angry. I laughed at him. He started shouting that I was fired and physically shoved me out of his office. True story. The irony is that he couldn't fire me because, if you remember, he had refused to hire me in the first place. I was paid by that scholarship for women, and that wasn't managed by the institute, but by the office of the university president. I'm not just telling you this because it's entertaining. It was also a rather rude awakening. It made me realize that this institute wasn't about knowledge discovery. It was about money making. And the more I saw of academia, the more I realized it wasn't just this particular institute and this particular professor. It was generally the case. The moment you put people into big institutions, the goal shifts from knowledge discovery to money making. Here's how this works.
Alrighty, that certainly opens a whole can of worms for us to discuss. But yeah, her comment was that the institute wasn't about knowledge discovery; it's about money making. So, thoughts on that, Luster?
Yeah, that's a very complex topic. What she explains there is that the research was used in such a way, and publications of textbooks were used in a way that they were making money. And this is, of course, some institutions or some groups have certain predatory ways of functioning where they are just focused on applying for projects, generating project applications, or textbooks, or getting money from students and so forth. I hope that this is not so common. But what does definitely happen is that there is some systemic pressure, and that's something that will be mentioned later in the video, and that's that there is a pressure from for the people working at universities or at scientific institutes to get certain amount of money that will help the institutions run. And that's something that Rahul and I exchanged messages before. And actually, often in Europe, academic institutions are losing money. So they get governmental funding, but operate in deficit. So they're losing money. That's common. And I think that's fine because this is not a profit organization. The profit is knowledge. The profit is not necessarily commercial profit. So the profit is to develop a great vaccine, to find, also to educate and to emancipate people. But what can happen with regard to teaching nowadays is that academic institutions are often expected to at least contribute to funding. So they're not always fully funded by the government, but they have to somehow earn the money that they're spending. And one way is through the teaching service, which is fair, right? So we are spending our time, we are teaching someone, we want to charge for that. So far, so good. And then there were problems in the past that some exams no one could pass, and that when you give too much academic freedom, or maybe there is no such a thing as too much academic freedom, but when you just don't regulate and don't put any work expectations on people, then they just don't do their job very well. Some professors don't show up, famously don't show up on exams, fail everyone, don't show up on their lectures, and that was creating a lot of problems. So then some expectations are placed. I mean, I'm simplifying, but in a nutshell, these are I mean, these are not anecdotes. These are real cases that there were such professors. And what happens then? Okay, there is some expectation, okay, that students should at least finish. So universities get money based on how many students finish. Because educators should also motivate students and teach them and engage and give high quality education and produce some successful scholars later. But that can also backfire, and it can now often backfire in the sense that now everybody passes, because you get money if you pass students, and then the quality decreases in the opposite sense, right? So everybody. So then it's just easy to give a passing grade, even though the knowledge quality is not high enough. The word spreads. It becomes more as a service and not as a real educational institution. So students expect to pass. They question their grades, try to dispute them. There are all these mechanisms for that, and you are again losing the attractiveness of the job, because the job of a teacher is to have certain freedom in teaching, to inspire your students, to have your own style. Somebody comes to listen to your lectures, to listen to you, to get feedback from you, and now you are all of a sudden in this corporation in which you're supposed to provide a service of teaching, give a lot of feedback, try to make sure that as many as possible students pass, and that of course then teachers have a less enjoyable job. So we are all the time between this Scylla and Charybdis, of two opposites, and one come from this full socialist ideal of letting everything go, and from this other ideal, capitalistic ideal, that everything has to be done like in a corporation, and that everything is a service and you're paying to study, so you are expecting certain service, and that's how it works. And we have to find a middle way. So I think there Aristotle's ideas of finding the sweet spot, the middle way, are actually very important also nowadays.
Indeed. I mean, part of me even wonders, Vlasta, if in some sense we'll never really hit that sweet spot, as in we never really find the perfect neutral ground. The philosopher Hegel has this idea that there's no neutrality. Neutrality itself always comes in some sense. It's tilted towards a certain side, and I kind of resonate with that, which is why in a way, it's as if the conversation has to keep going constantly. We will never really find the idyllic environment to where both sides are equally balanced. And I'm in fact, on the point you made about students being passed, I completely concur. I've always loved learning, but when I did my bachelor's degree, I studied computer science. I found that, I don't know, like they were teaching some really basic, some of the programs are really good. So fundamental, data structures, some mathematics, real foundational fields, but also there were like these project management stuff and all this which didn't interest me at all. And I found that the degree was called computer science, but it was more like software engineering for a corporation. Like that should have what the degree would have been called, because they were creating essentially employees instead of giving an exhaustive education. But I'm not particularly against that too, because some people don't care about education as some others do. Some people just want to get enough qualifications to to be employed, go to the marketplace. So I wonder if perhaps we should start reconsidering, maybe not everyone needs a full-fledged bachelor's degree. If you want to do a bachelor's degree, then perhaps do that. Take 3 to 4 years doing that. Or you could do, in Australia, we call them like TAFE courses, which are like diplomas that are more like skills oriented. So it's very industry oriented, and they're like 6 months, 1 year. Anyway, I'm just like thinking out loud here, but just a few thoughts there.
That also exists in Europe, of course. So one can definitely do that. But there, it's this other question that we raised before. So are we supposed to motivate people to pursue more education? Is there a benefit in just attending some lectures and attending, like somebody would say in their CV, I listened to the first year of philosophy courses?
Indeed. Yeah, I mean, I did that.
And of course, there is a freedom. There is freedom for people to choose that they don't want this, of course. But there is also something into promoting it.
Yeah. I think you make a very perspicacious point, Luster, because like, I don't believe in the idea that some people are innately more oriented towards learning and education, and some people aren't. I think a lot of it is cultural. It's nurture over nature. So as you mentioned, if we have a culture that does value learning, for the sake of knowledge, that values knowledge for the sake of knowledge alone, perhaps more people would be open to attending lectures, even though there isn't like a direct, tangible outcome or benefit from it. That's certainly something to consider. But yes, so perhaps we can...
Based on what you mentioned, there is another very important point, this nature versus nurture. This is that there are often these stereotypes which disciplines correspond to which genders.
Oh, of course.
And that is highly problematic.
Yeah.
And that's something we have to work on.
Yeah. I mean, I believe we touched on this before, right? I mean, some people think, like engineering, it would be more oriented towards men, or which is again, those are cultural things. It's nurture, not nature.
Yes.
In fact, interestingly, the first software engineers were women, because it was not a highly paid field. Therefore, this was in the 40s and 50s. It was given more to women, but obviously now it's shifted, where, if I'm not mistaken, 1 out of 10 software engineers are men. So, and it shows how dynamic and how malleable culture is, and how it shifts. Righty, we'll probably get to the rest of it.
Works. If a researcher gets a scholarship or research grant, then the institution gets part of that money. It's called the overhead. Technically, that's meant to pay for offices and equipment and administration, etc. But academic institutions then pay part of their staff from this overhead. So they need to keep that overhead coming. Small scholarships don't make much money, but research grants can be tens of millions of dollars. And the overhead can be anything between 15 and 50%. This is why research institutions exert loads of pressure on researchers to bring in grant money. And partly they do this by keeping the researchers on temporary contracts so that they need grants to get paid themselves, while the administrators who are paid on the overhead usually have permanent positions. But you get used to this kind of crap. And the overhead isn't even the real problem. The real problem is that the easiest way to grow in academia is to pay other people to produce papers on which you, as the grant holder, can put your name. That's how academia works. Grants pay students and postdocs to produce research papers for the grant holder. And those papers are what the supervisor then uses to apply for more grants. The result is a paper production machine in which students and postdocs are burned through to bring in money for the institution. Most of that money comes from your taxes. After my PhD, I applied for another scholarship and got that, and then I got a postdoc job and a grant and another job and another job and another grant and so on. And I began to understand what you need to do to get a grant or get hired. You have to work on topics that are mainstream enough, but not too mainstream. You want them to be a little bit edgy, but not too edgy. No, it needs to be something that fits into the existing machinery. And since most grants are 3 years or 5 years at most, it also needs to be something that can be wrapped up quickly. The more I saw of
So yeah, Sabine mentioned research topics need to be mainstream enough, but not too mainstream. I've heard this brought up by a lot of especially physicists kind of doing research, and I thought it was a very interesting point to discuss, Vlasta.
Yeah, that is the epistemic component. So what will be well evaluated, and that's how the funding, science funding, directs what's actually being explored and actually directs science, and doesn't leave enough academic freedom to do whichever research researchers consider to be needed. And there we have this problem that sometimes negative results are not valued enough, because we don't know whether always the science will give something fruitful. And that's why we now have this movement to pre-register the studies and to get credit just by having a good idea, nevertheless, of what will be the actual result of the project, because some great ideas and also negative results help science. Otherwise, we might end up in this problem that people are using, not only having the natural confirmation bias, this wish that we want to be right and that our hypothesis should be true, confirmed, but also that some people engage in academic misconduct. And in the video, it is also explained that scientific misconduct might result from the pressure, existential pressure of not having a permanent position, which then increases the pressure on applying for grants. And to apply for grants, one needs a lot of publications. And there again, another misconduct can happen, and this is to use or abuse the early career researchers and their work, so to sign on their work. However, if the system is such that it pressures everyone, so the pressure is also on more senior researchers. So if there is more protection on one group, the pressure will just end up with the other group. So the only way to remove that pressure is actually to structurally change ways science is funded. But science has to be funded based on merit so that people are motivated. And the merit has to be measured in some way. And then it will, of course, be measured through publications. But then we end up again in the question, which publications are the valuable ones? So we are looping all the time, and we have to find, again, some middle reasonable way. Another problem that can happen if there is no system of this peer review or competitive grant funding, it could be the gatekeeping. That in such a situation, only people who have current positions will be deciding at elitist type of institutions who would be deciding who will get opportunity to do science and have science funding. And the peer review process of publications, but also the peer review process of acquiring grants did open door to many researchers that otherwise wouldn't get opportunity to form their groups and be funded. So that should be always kept in mind. Plus, this rewarding people who are working hard also makes sense. But in that happens another thing, and this is that often people who already had funding, they aggregate more funding while someone else doesn't get the opportunity because it's some sort of a game that's being played. So that's being discussed, or that big science gets funding, so that in physics, large projects get funding and a lot of funding. So there are all sort of issues there, and the contemporary research on philosophy of science advocates for some type of diverse funding schemes, so that some people even advocate for lottery allocation of funding. I'm not sure whether I would go that far because that is not merit-based. However, after a certain threshold, if the proposals passed certain criteria, then maybe as one of the potential funding mechanisms, this could be considered. But the plurality of different types of funding potentially could benefit science. And then, of course, which projects will be funded is also determined by which type of research is considered to be beneficial for the society and needed for the society. And sometimes that's obvious, right? When you have the COVID crisis, then it's very obvious what needs to be funded. But it's important to keep in mind our previous topic, and this is that if you want a developed democratic society, you need education, and you of course need research in humanities.
Absolutely. Yeah, so Vlasta, I had three questions. Maybe firstly, perhaps elaborate a bit more, because I thought you made a very interesting point regarding, correct me if I'm wrong, pre-registering research. So what did you actually mean by that?
This is in psychology popular, but in some other disciplines, people would love to have it. For instance, in computer science, people would love to have it. This is you make a hypothesis, and you are assuming that your experiment will give certain results, and you're saying how you are designing your experiment, which statistical tools you will be using, which methods will you use. Which literature did you use to come up with this experiment? So you're pre-registering your study. That is also good for checking whether all the methodology is correct. But it can also be pre-registered in a journal, which means that you will publish it even if the results are negative, because you have a good idea that's worth publishing.
Yeah, the hypothesis itself is valuable. So, I know some people, some researchers don't really like the H index, but would it be the case that even if someone's pre-registered their hypothesis, it'll probably give them some score in the H index, even though it's not published in a peer review the way it would normally be?
So it can be also published, right? So it can be published as a negative result. That is not a problem per se. Of course, negative results are less cited, but this is this idea that people should get credit for the time that they spent on some good hypothesis, and that somebody judged first just the hypothesis and the research proposal, the project proposal, and deemed it worthy, and that's what should count. because attempts count, and negative
see.
results are very important for science, because that relates to Sabine's point that kind of you shouldn't explore anything too bold. Anything too bold is risky and might give a negative result. But if you just explore something that you're certain will work out, it's different, but not too different. It's not too risky. And then you're in this safe zone, but that's not how breakthrough results come about.
I see. Okay, I think I understand. It's sort of like the broader philosophical point here is that science thrives on failure, right? I mean, in the Karl Popperian sense. So just because an
Yes.
experiment fails, that doesn't mean it's a failure for science. That negative result itself has value for the enterprise of science.
Absolutely.
I see that. Okay, that makes a lot more sense.
And people, and but it also in this other concept. So you're crediting people for this, and you're stimulating them doing this instead of just doing something which is expected.
Yeah. And then this probably touches on the other question I want to ask you, that it, people can step outside of this kind of paper production loop, rat race, whatever you may call it, where researchers just produce things they know are going to get funding.
Yes.
All right. So the other question I had was regarding peer reviewing. Oops, my earphones. Regarding peer reviewing. And okay, so firstly, just I'd like to hear your general thoughts on the peer review process, Vlasta, but also perhaps touch on your on the interesting work you did on using ML, machine learning, for peer reviewing, because I thought that was quite interesting and a very, let's say, in vogue topic. So yeah, firstly, thoughts on peer reviewing, and then also, yeah, the paper regarding using ML for peer reviewing.
I think the peer reviewing is the best we have, and that should be good enough. And because if we would cancel the peer review, then we could end up in this problem that merit is not valued enough, and in addition to this other problem that people are not motivated and stimulated for their work because there is just some cartels of researchers that are gatekeeping everything. So I do believe that peer review opens door to more research to be published and to be done. Of course, it's not perfect. Machine learning, even now, some considerations of large language models evaluating academic texts are there with the, first of all, because they're very efficient. So they are much faster. I mean, are considered because they're much faster and much cheaper than having humans spending time on it. However, we have to keep in mind that academic merit and originality is hard to assess, and also this fear and to predict, and also this fear of again ending up in a loop that science is then being generated by AI, evaluated by AI, just looping, funded by AI, looping through AI. Of course, even that could give some epistemic benefits, but I still believe that humans have to keep track of what's happening there, especially because of the values that's going to be promoted through research. Because as we probably all know, no research is really value neutral, and it comes
Indeed.
with different values that we are incorporating in it. So in this sense, yes. And the last point is, of course, that human reviewers could be biased, while algorithms are more neutral and can be biased, as we know, but but might also not have some individual bias against a certain person. So maybe as some corrective mechanisms or as some informative tool, AI has its role and its place in this complex system.
Yeah, I mean, would you say?
But yeah, use it with caution.
Indeed, yeah. I mean, I think a lot of, because I'm not a fan of like these AI utopians. I think they're rather, frankly, sorry to sound arrogant, naive, but I think AI's, in my view, reading a paper, but also the previous discussions we've had, it should still be used purely as a tool, not as like a panacea where all of peer reviewing can be done by some LLM or some machine learning model.
I can very well imagine that a lot of people actually use it even nowadays to help them when they get a lot of requests to do reviewing. But again, it also depends a lot how one is relating with it. So they shouldn't use it because of the privacy issues. So they should only use it with large language models that they are opening locally.
Yeah.
So they have to be careful there, and then they also have to make sure that their word is final and not to trust the machine overriding their decisions and their instincts, which unfortunately some research is pointing out in other disciplines that it might happen, so that people might trust machines too much.
Yeah. That makes sense. Also, for the viewers, all the papers we've discussed, I'll leave them in the show notes. And the good thing is, as I mentioned, they're all open to the public, so they're not behind a paywall. So you could go read the papers. Alrighty, back to Sabine.
Of this, the more I realized this wasn't how I wanted to spend my life. The other thing that happened was that the more I saw of the foundations of physics, the more I became convinced that most of the research there wasn't based on sound scientific principles. I know this sounds wild, like I'm the crank next door on YouTube, and maybe that's what I am. But I like to think that my argument was, and still is, very academic. I never intended it to be offensive. I just explained why thinking up new particles isn't a good strategy for progress in physics, and why that had gotten an entire discipline stuck. And naive as I was, I expected physicists to think about it. I expected rational debate. But that never came. No one was interested. No one is interested. They were interested in writing more papers. And that's what they need all these particles and other wild ideas for, to write papers, to get grants, to get postdocs, to write more papers, and round it goes. Meanwhile, I had moved half around the world, and at some point you just accept the constant moving as normal because the only people you know also do it. It's incredibly hostile to personal life, detrimental to mental health, and women suffer from it more because our reproductive reality is that we need to start families earlier than men. By my mid-30s, I had somehow miraculously managed to get married and have 2 children, but I couldn't find a job anywhere near my husband. So for several years, I commuted from Frankfurt to Stockholm. And yes, those cities are actually in different countries. After 5 years of my murder commute, I just couldn't do it anymore. My mental health was worse than ever. I was permanently stressed out. I was feeling guilty for not working more and not spending more time with my kids. I had several nervous breakdowns. I was constantly ill. I decided I'd go back to Germany and not move out of the country again until the kids were out of school. Instead, I applied for research grants on projects that lasted 1, 2, or 3 years and that could be located in Germany. A lot of water has flown under the bridge since, so let me be honest. At this point, I'd figured out what you need to put into a grant proposal to get the money, and that's what I did. I applied for grants on research projects because it was a way to make money, not because I thought it would leave an impact in the history of science. It's not that what I did was somehow wrong. It was, and still is, totally state of the art. I did what I said I'd do in the proposal. I did the calculation. I wrote the papers. I wrote my reports, and the reports were approved. Normal academic procedure. But I knew it was bullshit, just as most of the work in that area is currently bullshit, and just as most of academic research that your taxes pay for is almost certainly bullshit. The real problem I had, I think, is that I was bad at lying to myself. Of course, I tried to tell myself and anyone who was willing to listen that at least unofficially on the side, I do the research that I thought was worth my time, but that I couldn't get money for because it was too far off the mainstream. But that research never got done because I had to do the other stuff that I actually got paid for. Then COVID came and it reminded me how short life really is. I pivoted, applied for funding on the research that I wanted to do, that I was rather afraid wouldn't get funded. It didn't get funded. And so here we are on YouTube, where I talk about why I love science and hate it at the same time. This sounds like a sad story, and in some sense it is, because it's the story of a young scientist whose dream died. And it's the story of an old scientist who thinks they could have made a difference if it hadn't been necessary to get past 5 reviewers who didn't share my interests, because that's what it comes down to eventually. It's not that they say there's something wrong with your proposal. It just doesn't excite them because it's not the main current interest. My problem has always been that I just didn't fit in. But there's
So I think she now speaks about other stuff. So I think that the past is part of it's something that we like to call academic life, and it's what they are saying. Sometimes they're also joking. Some people with whom I talked about it. You think it's a permanent job, just it's not. You have a temporary contract, but you're permanently working. So you work overtime, and you have to move from country to country, and that's part of this academic life. So not an academic job, but an academic life where people have some which they also joke about and call two-body problem, that partners are split in different countries. But it can also happen for people who are single, that they have to move away from their families, from their friends. And one thing is having a positive motivation to move, to learn, to explore. And another thing is to have a negative motivation to move. And this means you cannot get a job opportunity where you are. So you have to move somewhere in order to have bread on your table. And or a stimulating environment, or in some disciplines like for instance biology, you might need to go to some rich institutions if you want to have funding for your research projects, because in other institutions there is just not enough funding for your experiments. So there are all these issues which affect well-being of people, so mental health, but also physical well-being, and that is discussed in the video, and also family planning and having a family. And we are again talking about people who invested a lot in education, who are trying to benefit society, or at least most of them are trying to do that, and they are under this very strong pressure. Again, I can also understand that some people find certain pleasure in this prestige that comes with science, but I think this is really a minority. So I think most people suffer from that. And then there's some very basic challenges that this academic life is bringing. So if someone doesn't have a permanent position, then this person cannot get a credit, a loan for a house, cannot even know in which country they will wake up the next year. So this is really challenging for planning a family. It can also be just moving from one city to another city. And is there a real need for that in order to kind of get the best out of the best? I don't really think so. And I again think that participates in making this job not so attractive. So if there is not so much, right, so people are treated as something that's dispensable, and they are not very respected by the students. They are not very respected by the funding agencies. they don't have permanent jobs, but on the other hand, they are very hardworking and their families are suffering, then of course that they will leave academia and have stories like the one that we just listened to, that somebody thinks that they could have made a difference, but just didn't have the opportunity.
So would you say also that most academics are kind of in this uncertain position where, or would you say that most people who go into academia generally do find some kind of employment, stable employment within a university setting?
Oh, that is a very interesting question. So yeah, regarding this academic life, of course, to some degree, it might be more difficult to women. That was mentioned in the video, but I am not necessarily. I wouldn't necessarily sign that, because there are also other underprivileged groups in academia who have it very tough. So I think definitely for anyone belonging to an underprivileged group, it's difficult. But even to the people who are in the privileged group, or as we would call it, a privileged group, also this academic life takes a huge toll, and of this constant moving. So that was something that I wanted to point out. But
Yeah.
sorry, could you please repeat your question?
Well, no, my question was because like I see what you're saying, and part of me, because I'm kind of like going through this in some way, not immediately because I'm self-employed in my job, but given eventually I'd like to go into academia too, I'm thinking, well, people move, generally people do tend to move around for work. People get different offers, so regardless of if you're in academia or in industry.
Yeah.
But I'm trying to understand more how is it different for an academic or academic life as opposed to the general person, the lay person, or the non-academic person, if I could put it that way.
Yeah, and you had also this other question: what are the other options, job options for
Indeed,
academics?
yes. Yeah. Sorry.
Okay.
I guess that's kind of where I was going with that. So my idea was, okay, how does it differ from the normal person? But then also, if someone does go and put in, around 10 years of like masters and a PhD, all of that upfront time, and invest all that time, then what are the other options? Do they stay in academia, or do most people leave afterwards? Generally speaking, of course, I mean, it's really hard to look at these things empirically, because it's, especially if it's globally, but just what are your intimations on that?
Yeah. So regarding this question of what happens once somebody gets finishes the PhD and or also stays in academia and so on, I think there are different opinions and different experiences. But what I always was saying to my colleagues, and this is when you are a highly educated, hardworking person, you will of course get a nice job and you just have to search for it, whether it will be in academia or outside of academia. I don't think it matters so much. I think people should be open-minded and flexible, and that's much more healthy also psychologically. But just we shouldn't sell ourselves short, so we should aim for high positions if we invested a lot in our education. That makes sense, and that's perfectly normal. But so I remember one colleague of mine saying, and he's now a professor, but he was saying, if this fails, I will have to work in McDonald's. And I'm like, no, with your education, knowledge, everything you're bringing to the table, hard work, CV, you will not have to work in McDonald's. You could be an editor in a publishing company. You can be a policy advisor. There's so many wonderful opportunities that one can have with their education. And their education is the key of opening many nice career perspectives, and that's why I do believe in this motivating people to pursue more education. I mean, partially, that's not the only reason, as we discussed. And
Absolutely.
regarding what is What is the
No,
difference?
I just agreed. Yeah.
Yeah. What is the difference between? I think in person would be much nicer to interact. I think online
I
is
know.
never
Sometimes there's a
clear.
lag between. Yeah. Well, the next time I'm in the Netherlands, I'll give you a shot for sure.
Yeah, that would be much nicer. Yes. And the difference between this academic life and someone having a job in industry, I think in academia we can learn a lot from industry. And that is something I also discuss in my paper, that kind of people often criticize industry, but industry has some positive ways and patterns and work habits, because they learned over time what works and what doesn't. So industry improved, and academia should also improve. And regarding this position, is there is one question: is this positive versus negative motivation? If someone is moving to get a better job, and for pleasure, already having a nice job but getting a higher position, that is a positive motivation. But if someone is moving because there is no other option, then this is a negative motivation for moving. And there is a big difference between the two. And then also the second point is about the contracts, right? So having a probation period of 6 months and afterwards a permanent contract is much nicer than having constant 2-year contracts, which is often the case for postdocs. Because what can one do within 2 years? That's a rather short time for research, and also in general for settling somewhere in some city and so forth. And the last thing is about, touches the questions we discussed in the very beginning, and this is this culture. And often in industry there is now awareness that the work culture is very important, and the discrimination should not be happening, and that there are certain ways of communication there, and this is followed, and there are instruction manuals and there are workshops regarding it, and people pay attention to it. While in academia this is not happening so much yet. Of course there are some positive movements, and that's if we improve the culture in this sense in academia, I think the whole work environment will become much better, and people will be more satisfied with their work conditions.
Absolutely. Yeah, I was going to ask. I mean, I think the end of the Sabine's video is just her talking about how grateful she is for the YouTube community. But what's really interesting, I was thinking about this, was that Sabine Hossenfelder is obviously an anomaly. I mean, she built this public platform. She's one in thousands, and unfortunately, the majority of academics who probably went through what she went through weren't able to still do what she loves, which is to educate people on science and to be in the field of science. Majority of people probably would have either given up or moved to industry or kind of completely switched careers in some way. Having said that, plus, I guess to conclude, perhaps, what do you think are some takeaway insights for like someone interested in going into academia? And then this is a bit of a selfish question for a person like me who's just getting started. What advice would you have on like how to navigate through this morass of academic life?
I think one advice would be to be the change you want to see. So to be authentic and to do what you think is correct, and guide, be the leader in what you want to see as the change. And I think that matters. And of course, gather people like-minded to you. Also search for mentors. That can be very helpful. And be flexible. So I don't think that this fixed mindset that it's either one way or no way is something healthy. So just be open to possibilities, and they will come, and use the ones that you want to use. I think what is also not healthy is that people often in academia say yes to everything because there's so much in fear, and don't say no to stuff. And there is, of course, this nice exercise that whenever you say yes to something, to some additional activity. So you have this paper, it says yes to something else, right? But it says no to you. And when you say no to an additional activity, you're saying yes to yourself. So I think be kind to yourself, think that you are really worthy of all those things. We are very precious, and respect yourself and take care of yourself. When
Indeed.
you do that, others will also follow, hopefully. But again, prioritize your well-being, and then you always remember that you're why are you doing what you're doing, right? And but not to the expense of your health and of your well-being. However, I do believe that we all together are making a lot of changes, and changes are happening, and we are all discussing these questions. And the fact that this video became viral is just showing that a lot of people are thinking the same and want to support these changes and are aware of the problems. So I wouldn't be pessimistic, because we are seeing that all in all, there are positive developments.
Absolutely. That's a beautiful place to end it. And in fact, just on the note of meeting like-minded people, I'm grateful that we met. I mean, this for me, this reason I started this podcast was exactly for that. Plus, that was because I felt outside of academia, people weren't really interested in the kind of the eccentricities that you and I would be like. Who in the world would read, Karl Popper or Thomas Kuhn? I mean, the general people don't care about what science even is. In fact, I'd even argue that's one of the downfalls of science. People think of science as like a black box where you just put in information and magically theories come out, but it's not the case. It's a very complicated system with its own problems, with its own self-correcting mechanism. And I find that, which is why for me, kind of the work you do, meta science, it's so valuable to not treat science as a black box. And then, as you mentioned, discussing all the other social factors that are a part of science itself. So the overall point I was trying to make was, sorry, I tend to be long-winded, is that I am grateful that we connected, and thank you for coming on my podcast the last time. And I hope in many ways, I'm sorry to sound like I'm flattering you here, but I consider you like a role model after going through your CV. I'd want to kind of have a career similar to yours, and absolutely, if it's possible, I would love to, have all my work published, if I do end up publishing stuff publicly, because I think that's a great service for lay people like myself.
Thank you for these kind words. I think that every teacher lives through their students, and then also hearing that someone might be inspired who is not even my direct student, but someone in another continent and so on, it's really touching. And I really like talking to you and all your thoughts, and also these ideas of communicating in these more interesting ways. Because to me, making a reaction video would never cross my mind, or making these wonderful thumbnails which you did. I think that's really important, because we have to move forward and to do things which are now interesting and are speaking to everyone, to a wider public, and of course sorry, I just got touched. Yeah, thank you so much.
Absolutely, yeah. No, that was absolutely sincere. But no, that was no better way of putting it. Thank you, Vlasta.